The Young and the Restless spoilers. Kane's world was already teetering on the edge of collapse when Victor Newman placed the final piece of leverage squarely against him, and in that moment, the pressure that had been quietly building beneath the surface erupted into fury. Kane had always lived his life balancing secrets upon lies, crafting elaborate facades that only a few truly sharp minds could pierce, but somehow Victor had gone deeper than anyone else ever dared. The discovery was humiliating, maddening, and terrifying all at once, and as Victor delivered his threats with that cold, commanding tone, Kane felt the walls closing in. He could not believe the sheer audacity of this man. Why was Victor so reckless? Why did he pry so relentlessly into affairs that should never have been his concern? It was as though Victor's hunger for control had grown into something unhinged, a mania cloaked beneath the polished armor of a businessman, and Kane's rage simmered to a boiling point at the thought that this tyrant now held his fate in the palm of his hand. But nothing in Genoa City was ever as straightforward as it seemed, and while Kane was trembling with fury, there was another figure lurking in the shadows who had anticipated this chain of events with almost chilling precision. Michael Baldwin, ever the cunning tactician, had positioned himself as more than just a lawyer or ally. His sharp eyes had followed Victor's maneuvers closely, connecting threads that others overlooked, digging through evidence like a patient detective unraveling a labyrinth. He had known for some time that Victor was becoming reckless, that his compulsion to dominate would eventually lead him to overreach, and so Michael crafted his strategy accordingly. Every secret Victor unearthed, every bit of dirt he weaponized against Kane, Michael had foreseen, and the knowledge that Victor's supposed brilliance might only be a pawn in Michael's larger game sent chills through those few who understood the scale of the situation. The horror, though, was not in the secrets themselves but in the storm that was about to break, because once Kane snapped, and he would, there would be no turning back from the darkness that followed. The frightening part of Kane's rage was not simply the loud, dramatic threats he spewed into the night but the raw sincerity behind them. He was no longer a man juggling lies to keep his life afloat, but something far more primal, a man stripped down to fury and vengeance, ready to burn bridges and bodies alike. Victor might have thought that holding Kane's secrets would grant him control, but in reality, it had pushed Kane beyond fear. Anger was freedom for him, an intoxicating release from the suffocating grip of manipulation. When Victor tightened his hold, Kane resolved to unleash hell, his every thought consumed by the idea of erasing the man who had dared expose him. He would not merely defend himself, he would retaliate with such ferocity that no one in Genoa City would forget what it meant to cross Kane Ashby. And then, in the midst of this swirling chaos, a revelation that no one had anticipated began to take form: Colin Atkinson was still alive. Long believed to be dead, long thought to be another ghost of Kane's tormented past, Colin had never truly vanished. He had slipped into the shadows, a predator biding his time, watching from a distance as his son stumbled through the labyrinth of lies and betrayals that seemed to define his life. Colin knew better than anyone how dangerous Victor could be, but he also understood that sometimes the true threat was not the man wielding the weapon but the weapon itself. By allowing the world to think he was gone, Colin had preserved his freedom, evaded the enemies he had accumulated over decades, and retained his ability to strike when the moment was right. Now, with Kane cornered and Victor pressing his advantage, that moment had arrived. Colin's presence was not meant to comfort but to shield in the most brutal way imaginable. He had no illusions about his son's flaws, no delusions about Kane's missteps, but he saw in him a reflection of his own defiance, his own cunning, and his own unquenchable will to survive. Kane might rage against Victor in loud declarations, but Colin's vengeance would be quieter, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Victor had made the mistake of thinking Kane stood alone, of believing that his power and reputation were enough to crush one man's resistance. What he had failed to account for was that Kane was not alone, he had blood bound to him, blood that had cheated death itself, and that blood had returned to balance the scales. The night Kane finally snapped was one of violence, chaos, and catharsis. His fury boiled over into a confrontation that tore away any lingering vestiges of civility between him and Victor. Screaming, fists flying, threats spilling out like venom, Kane's wrath was terrifying in its purity. He hurled accusations, cursed Victor's arrogance, and vowed with the raw intensity of a man who had nothing left to lose that he would never allow Victor to walk away unscathed. The sheer force of his anger was enough to rattle even a man as seasoned and hardened as Victor Newman. Yet what truly marked the turning point was the moment Colin emerged from the shadows, not as a ghost but as flesh and blood, aligning himself with his son in an act of brutal solidarity. Together, Kane and Colin launched their assault, a storm of pent-up rage and vengeance that Victor had not fully anticipated. The great Victor Newman, master manipulator, titan of business, patriarch of power, suddenly found himself overwhelmed not by corporate schemes or legal traps but by raw, physical violence. He fought, of course, because Victor never surrendered easily, but even he could not withstand the ferocity of two men hell-bent on his destruction. Blow after blow landed, each fueled by years of resentment, betrayal, and hatred, until finally Victor's body gave way, collapsing under the weight of their combined assault. The image of him, once so commanding, slumped unconscious, was one that seared itself into Kane's memory, not as a victory but as a declaration that he was no longer the hunted but the hunter. Yet victory, if it could be called that, was hollow and fleeting. Victor was not dead, not yet, but his body was dragged into darkness, locked away in a room stripped of windows, stripped of light, stripped of the empire he had always clung to. For once, he was powerless, reduced to nothing more than a captive at the mercy of the very man he had sought to control. Kane and Colin left him there, unconscious in the suffocating silence of the room, the air heavy with the weight of what they had done and what might come next. The terror of the situation was not in Victor's downfall but in the uncertainty that followed. A man like Victor, even when caged, was dangerous. If he woke, if he spoke, if he plotted, the war that would ignite could engulf not only Kane and Colin but everyone connected to them. For Kane, though, the darkness offered a strange sort of satisfaction. Standing over Victor's limp form, he felt both empowered and haunted. He had crossed a line from which there was no return, a line that made him less a victim of Victor's schemes and more a monster of his own making. Colin, watching with a mixture of pride and grim pragmatism, understood that this was only the beginning. The horror story had only just begun, and the final chapter would be far darker than anyone could yet imagine. Beneath the polished stone of Kane's villa in Nice, below the rooms where chandeliers softened the edges of power and where the Mediterranean wind whispered of freedom, a second house existed, narrow corridors in poured concrete, a lattice of vent shafts, a security grid braided across steel beams, a bunker that swallowed sound and hope with equal appetite. That was where the truth lived. Colin had not died. He had simply stepped out of circulation and into the crawlspace below his son's life. He let newspapers declare him a ghost, let old adversaries toast to their victory, let police folders turn cold and yellow at the corners. He slept during the day, ate in irregular hours, and listened to other men's sins move like liquid through wire. Every cable in the house bent toward that underground core, every camera, every redundant lock, every burner line routed into a control array he had assembled from auctioned corporate scrap and military refuse. The villa above was the mask. The basement was the face. And because the currents of this family always pulled toward the deepest, darkest thing, it was inevitable that the feud with Victor would be dragged here, down to the room where consequences were unavoidable and air was charged with that metallic ache that precedes a storm. Everyone converged because they had to. Kane driven by humiliation and panic, Victor by the instinct to dominate even a dungeon, and, invisibly at first, Michael Baldwin by the calm arithmetic of cause and effect that had never failed him when bullies overplayed their hand. The house had gravity now, and the city answered to it, though no one walking past on the sunlit street could have guessed what the foundations were carrying. Colin had planned this convergence with an engineer's cold patience. He had watched Kane posture and improvise, win small battles and lose larger ones, and he saw a simple pattern. His son's brilliance was sharp but brittle, his nerve impeccable until it needed to hold under a load that did not let up. So Colin designed a structure that would not ask Kane to be something he was not. He erected decoys and myths to absorb the impact when attention became lethal. He named those myths as if naming a ship, the most important of which was Aristotle Dumas. On paper, Aristotle signed transfers and countersigned endowments. In encrypted ledgers, he made arrangements with airless precision. In whispered rumor, he frightened the sort of men who declare themselves immune to fear. In reality, Aristotle Dumas was a box that Colin built and filled with other men's credulity. He fed it Kane's silhouette when that silhouette would misdirect a threat. He fed it ghost passports and cloned voices and the plausible fiction of a European upbringing with an education in obsolete languages. He fed it fragments of his own biography, then rearranged the fragments so that anyone tracing a line back to the creator would meet a curve that led them in circles. When crowds told each other that Kane was Aristotle, Colin let them, because sometimes the lie he needed most was the one his enemies invented for him. And when a smaller, harder circle of professionals insisted that no, the hand behind Aristotle was older, colder, a man who had already died once on paper and found it agreeable, Colin allowed that rumor too. The best mask is a paradox. It is most effective when it never resolves. Victor woke to paradox and iron. The first sensation was weight, not the weight of the cage itself, though four reinforced corners and a cross-braced ceiling pressed into the air like an argument that could not be contradicted, but the weight of containment set against a soul that did not recognize the concept. Victor's life had been a geometry of rooms where he was the force and other people the variables. This was a room that refused to solve for him. He tested the welds with his palms, pushed until cords in his shoulders threatened to snap, and then he did what a man like him does when the body concedes a stalemate. He made the space ring with his will. The ceiling caught his voice and drove it into the floor hurled it back. Threats were made with absolute confidence, not because he expected them to be honored but because he understood that in a war of nerves, the man who keeps speaking writes the first sentence of the next move. He listed names of those who would miss him and those who would burn cities to retrieve him. He promised consequences that sounded less like punishments than axioms. Kane stood in the doorway outside the bars and did not flinch, his jaw set in the stubborn line of someone insisting to himself that this room, this decision, was the only place left where he could be right. He said this cellar would be Victor's end and believed it with the ferocity of any man who has exhausted his safer beliefs. The declaration bought him momentary courage, but courage bought on credit always demands repayment, and Victor, even caged, began to collect. He did not argue. He simply laid out, in cruel and elegant sequence, what happens to pawns when kings reshuffle the board, how timing is a weapon, and how a son living above his father's grave can never be sure whether the ghost is guardian or jailer. It was less a taunt than a diagnosis, and diagnoses have a way of lingering in a patient's blood. Above ground, the vacuum left by Victor's disappearance became a weather event. The Newman machine, so often the hammer in other men's crises, suddenly had to play locksmith to its own locked door. Nicky went still in the way of people who cannot afford to move until they understand the terrain. Victoria mobilized resources with an efficiency that would have impressed her father if he had not already expected it. Nick prioritized in concentric circles, family first, witnesses next, rivals always in a separate file with red corners. Adam behaved like a variable on purpose, helping just enough to be indispensable and oblique just enough to retain leverage. Meanwhile, Michael Baldwin, who had once learned to measure power not by net worth but by the precision with which a threat is applied, parsed the puzzle. If Victor had been taken, it could not have been on a whim. If a whim, it would never have escalated to silence. He pulled shipping records that did not look like shipping records and utility statements that pretended not to be utilities, traced the cold breath of an electrical load in an old European district where the buildings did not need so much power unless they were being asked to do something unnatural. He saw, in a cluster of innocuous lines, the outline of a basement that drank electricity at midnight and slept through noon. He remembered Colin's talent for hiding in plain sight and Kane's talent for thinking he invented his hiding places. The flight to France felt shorter than it was, because logic rarely takes the scenic route. By the time Michael's car crested the Old Hill Road and the villa came into view in the amber hour, he had already made 2 lists, reasons why Victor could not be there, and reasons why, despite himself, he was. Downstairs the temperature dropped half a degree, the kind of change a human senses only when fear needs an accomplice. Kane paced, then went still, then paced again. What he wanted, what he had always wanted, was to make the future ask his permission. But the past had asked nothing, and it had brought Colin with it. His father emerged from a side corridor in that predatory quiet that always made Kane feel both safer and less free. Colin surveyed the cage, the monitors, the respirator line that could flood the room with clean air or pull it away, and he was satisfied by his own craftsmanship. He explained, almost gently, that no one outside suspected because he had built the suspicion into the wrong places. If rescue came, it would come in the wrong direction first. If the police were called, the first door they battered would be the one he wanted them to. Kane did not want the lesson, he wanted closure. He wanted Victor erased and with him the humiliation of being read, of being cornered, of being taught by the man who had taught himself to fear nothing. That was the hunger that made him speak of endings. Yet Colin's eyes, pale and steady, held a colder appetite. He had designed the trap not merely to finish Victor but to sand down Kane's remaining illusions. There is no loyalty in a myth, there is only usefulness. He had made Aristotle Dumas to be useful. He had made this room to be definitive. And if his son could not bring himself to close the circuit, Colin would reach for the switch himself, because that is what architects do when a bridge refuses to bear the weight they promised.